All right, good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming. I appreciate it. My name is John. I'm going to be talking to all of you about the health implications of processed food. So what is the big deal with processed food? So it's a term that's thrown around a lot, sometimes a little bit too loosely, in my opinion. So a lot of times you'll hear, actually, no, I'll just get into that. So what I'm going to be talking about today, things we can look forward to. I'm going to be talking about what are processed foods. So I'm giving a couple definitions, explaining the categorization of what they are, why this is important, what do we already know, what is the impact of this information, and then what can we do about it. So how can we use this information to help us? So question, and something that makes me passionate about this area, is you hear this all the time, I wonder what I can do to start eating healthier. And usually one of the first things that jumps out at people, no more processed foods. But you may not necessarily, what is it about the processed foods that is bad? I've taught a couple of nutrition education classes to kids, and half the time I ask them, okay, is this a nutrient-dense food or not? And, okay, why? Well, it's processed, so it's bad. Like, okay, well, what about the processing process is making it a not nutrient-dense food? So, I'll give you a quick definition of what processed versus ultra-processed. So we've thrown that term ultra-processed around a lot today in a lot of the research that we found. So processed foods, loose definition, undergone change before being sold. So you can see how that can incorporate a lot of things. I've got a couple examples in a couple slides as well. Ultra-processed foods is a fairly specific definition. Typically 5 or more ingredients, substances that are not often used in culinary prep. So things like hydrolyzed protein, modified starches, hydrogenated oils like the trans fats. And they often have additives to improve appeal. So texture, color, flavor, things like that. The way they classify these, there's 4 different groups, and I'll be diving into that in a second. It was classified by the University of Sao Paulo in Brazil using something they call the NOVA classifications. So that's what I'll be diving into right here. So this is how they started. Started off with 3 big groups. Group 1, unprocessed and minimally processed foods. 2, processed culinary or food industry ingredients. And then 3 is the ultra-processed food. So when they were first developing these categories, they looked at that and they were happy with that. And then they thought, that's not good enough. Let's get into a little bit more detail. So they made 2 groups under group 3. There's group 3.1, processed food products. And then 3.2, ultra-processed food products. So that's when it starts to get a little bit tricky. And then they said, you know what? Let's just name them 3 and 4. And you're thinking, okay, what's going on? It's getting more complicated. They're dragging this out a little bit. So what really are they going to do? So this is what they originally came up with the definition for just processed foods. Generally produced to be consumed as part of meals or dishes, or may be used together with ultra-processed products to replace food-based, freshly prepared dishes and meals. That's a lot. You got to read that 4 or 5 times to really get a grasp of what it is. And if you think that's complicated, this is the transition of ultra-processed foods. The definition, you can see how long it is. It got longer and then shorter. So it did you all a real big favor and summarized it for us. So here is where we're at. Group 2, processed culinary ingredients. So these are defined as substances that are extracted from foods, used in kitchens, used in culinary preparation. Processed foods, food products that are manufactured with the inclusion of the processed culinary ingredients. So the unprocessed foods use the processed culinary ingredients to create those processed foods. And then there's the definition of those ultra-processed foods. Again, typically 5+ ingredients, not used in culinary prep typically, and then used to improve appeal, whether it's texture or color. And that gives us 4 primary groups that we'll be talking about. Unprocessed or minimally processed, processed culinary ingredients, processed foods, and then ultra-processed foods. So I've got some lovely examples for you. So examples of unprocessed, minimally processed, this probably shouldn't be too much of a shock. You've got the whole grains. Pasteurized products are considered minimally processed, so the milk and the eggs. Dried fruits, meats, and then fresh fruits and vegetables as well. Processed culinary ingredients, these are things like sugars, salts, butter, and then oils as well. So it may not necessarily always be nutrient dense, but not always not nutrient dense either. Processed foods. I was a little bit surprised when I was doing some research and looking at some of these. Canned vegetables, canned meats. Down at the bottom left, that's jerky. Then you have cheese, and then fresh baked breads are considered processed foods. So when people throw that term out, I don't think they normally are considering fresh baked breads to be a processed food. And then the ultra processed, you have the chips, some of the yogurts, the packaged breads, so bread in a package, not fresh baked, packaged noodles, and then packaged ingredients like the cakes and things like that. So the big thing is if you take those unprocessed foods and you combine them with the processed culinary ingredients, it gives you the processed foods. So you can see how that category can be like a catch-all. If you take an unprocessed food, cook it with a culinary ingredient that's processed, it becomes a processed food. So you can see how that category can get fairly big or fairly large. So why is this important? So ultra-processed food has been shown to be associated with increased LDL cholesterol. It's typically the bad cholesterol, or the one that we don't want much of. Hypertension, high blood pressure, and increased blood glucose as well. So, however, it's unclear whether the association is due to the nutrient content of the ultra-processed foods or the processing itself. All processing levels from each of those four NOVA categories were shown to contribute to nutrient intake as well. So it kind of hints on the nutrient properties being a little bit more important than whether or not it's processed. People are also more likely to meet the recommendations if they're consuming nutrient-dense foods, whether they're processed or not. So that processed category is pretty big. You can get a lot of good nutrients from fresh baked whole grain breads. That's still considered a processed food. So, what do we already know? Approximately 42% of daily energy intake from this population is from ultra-processed foods. So you can see why this is relevant, because it's a large chunk, large percentage of people are consuming. It's making up a large percent of the daily intake. Processed foods and processed culinary ingredients are kind of in the middle, and then the second highest is the unprocessed and minimally processed foods there. So that's just a breakdown of kind of expanding on why it's relevant, because we are consuming a lot of ultra-processed foods. So what is the impact, essentially? So I'm going to dive into some of the research here. So this first one, they looked at ultra-processed foods and the overall nutritional quality of those diets in the U.S. So their objective was to examine the relationship between energy contribution of ultra-processed foods in the U.S. diet and the critical nutrient contents. So we looked diving into the specific nutrients of these ultra-processed foods. So the study design was a cross-sectional study. They used U.S. residents from 2009, 2010. They used NHANES data, which is a National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey. So they know what they're talking about. They know what they're doing. They're organized by the CDC, Center for Disease Control and Prevention, and they kind of go around the country, essentially a mobile home, and do a lot of analysis with individuals. They had 9,300 participants. As long as they were over a year old, their data could be included. So for the diet analysis, they performed 2 24-hour recall interviews. First one was in person, and then the second one they followed up with the individuals 3 to 10 days later. They typically call them. The food was categorized using those ANOVA classifications that I spent a little bit of time describing before. So they broke it down. They determined the energy of ultra-processed foods compared to total intake. So what percentage of their total intake was coming from ultra-processed foods? They combined the minimally processed and the processed culinary ingredients to make it a little bit easier to analyze. They analyzed the nutrients using these food nutrition data analysis right there, the databases, the word I was looking for. They also adjusted for age, sex, race and ethnicity, income, and education level. So what did they find? They found that 57% of the daily calories were coming from ultra-processed foods. So lots of the daily intake was coming from that. 30.2% was unprocessed or minimally processed. So this is kind of agreeing with what we saw in that previous study. And then about 12% was from processed foods and culinary ingredients. So for the nutrient analysis, they showed, you can see on the left, is all the way on the left are the different nutrients. That column with the numbers on the left is the group with the lowest amount of ultra-processed food intake compared to the ones on the right, which was the highest So you can see a significant difference in the amount of protein. People eating less processed food are consuming more protein. People consuming less ultra-processed foods were getting a lower percentage of carbohydrates. Added sugar, higher processed was getting more. Saturated fats, higher processed was getting more. And then fiber, which they analyzed using grams per 1,000 calories. The lowest group of ultra-processed foods was getting more fiber as well. So this kind of breaks down the specific nutrients that we're looking at instead of just throwing the term processed at it. You can see what specifically the difference is between those two for these nutrients. So I just threw this up here so you can see from the least on the way left, the most on the way right, what the highest consumed ultra-processed foods are. And number one is breads. So I kind of mentioned a lot of people don't even think about that, the packaged breads. They tend to eat a lot of bread, and that kind of shows that in the ultra-processed category. So for the unprocessed and the minimally processed, meat and fresh fruits and vegetables and dairy tend to be the highest, which is a good thing. So for this article, they did have a large representation of the population, but they didn't go into too much detail about who the population was covering. They mentioned that they had to be hired, or U.S. residents older than 1 year, but didn't go into too much detail from that. They did analyze specific nutrients. They did find that sodium was not significantly different between the high and low groups, and I feel like sodium is one of those factors we often throw out or we throw into the conversation when we're talking about processed foods. They did only do 2 diet recalls within 2 weeks. This is a relatively short time frame, but when you do a large observational study like that, it's kind of the lesser of two evils. So, they did break down the details of the macro and micronutrients. I only dove into a couple of them, but they did kind of expand on a lot more. One negative or another negative was that they were limited with the NHANES survey, so they had fewer food items included than was ideal, so they were limited to that survey that the NHANES provided to those participants. So this is the evidence analysis library grading that Abby kind of touched on that we would be doing. So I gave this one a neutral rating. Reason being, there was a loosely defined criteria when it comes to the inclusion of the participants. So the other ones, they did pretty well. They were comparable study groups. Everyone was measured the same. They used a reputable form of data collection and analysis using the NHANES. The outcomes were defined, energy versus the ultra-processed food, comparing that to the nutrients. The measurement was valid. It was organized and monitored by the CDC. And downfall is that they did have few details about the population, but the people who were collecting the data were blinded. They didn't know what that data was going to be used for. They're just collecting all of it. So that one got a neutral rating. We're moving into the second study. This one specifically looks at ultra-processed food consumption compared to non-communicable diseases. So their objective was to examine the association between those ultra-processed foods and diet-related recommendations for preventing non-communicable diseases. So why is this one specifically important? Non-communicable diseases, it's a disease that develops as a result of a combination of genetic, physiological, environmental factors, and they are responsible for approximately 70% of the deaths worldwide. Huge, huge number. Examples are cardiovascular disease, cancer, diabetes, and lung disease. So study design, this one was performed in the UK, United Kingdom. It was another cross-sectional study. This one was a little bit longer, 2008 to 2014. They used the UK's National Diet and Nutrition Survey, which is similar to their form of NHANES, however focused specifically on the nutrition side of it. 9,300, almost 9,400 participants. They had to be greater than 1.5 years old, so kind of similar to that first article, very comparable. But they did split it up so that they had half and half participants, half adults and then half children. So they kind of focused on that. For the diet, they did a 4-day food diary, which is a little bit more, takes a little bit more for the participants to kind of contribute or, record that data. But the researchers did follow up with the individuals that gave their information, called them, had an interview and reviewed it with them to make sure there weren't any missing pieces. So a little bit more accurate there. They also use those NOVA classifications for the analysis. So they also looked at the percentage of energy intake. They use the World Health Organization's recommendations in order to evaluate the prevalence of the risk factors for non-communicable diseases. So they were looking to see if people had met these recommendations or went over them or were under them. Added sugar, saturated fat, fiber, sodium, and potassium. So they were looking at these 5 key things because they've been shown in other research to increase the risk of non-communicable diseases. So they analyze the nutrients using the Department of Health's Nutrient Data Bank. So what did they find? Very similar numbers up top when it comes to amount of ultra-processed foods intake. Unprocessed and minimally processed, those are still the top 2, so that's staying consistent between all the research that we've gone through so far. As the ultra-processed food increase, the prevalence of inadequate nutrient intake increased as well. So inadequate doesn't mean just not enough. Inadequate, just an inappropriate amount. So if it's the added sugar, it can be too high. So if you look down at the bottom in that table, you can see people with more ultra-processed foods, very, very significantly more added sugar in their diet, more sodium, saturated fat. They did have more fiber, which is good, right? And then potassium, they had more potassium as well. So they're ticking 3 of those boxes for significantly different risk factors that they were kind of hitting those boxes for. So also, just to compare it, very similar to the first study, the most consumed ultra-processed food was the breads, and then the most consumed unprocessed foods was dairy. So comparable to the other ones. And then you've got the fruits and some of the meats up at the top as well. So outstanding thoughts for this article specifically, kind of strengths and weaknesses. The participants were randomly selected. However, I mentioned that they had half and half, adults and children. They wanted to have a good sample of the population. With that, sometimes they purposefully selected certain individuals, certain households, to try and keep that criteria at that 50-50. So it was random, but not 100% random. They did kind of pick and choose some things here and there to fit those age gaps. They checked the food diary with participants to fill in the gaps. I think that's huge. Having someone fill out the food log and diary, sometimes you get a little bit more detail compared to the 24-hour recall. And then they also analyzed and looked through those and made sure that they didn't miss anything from those. They determined the non-communicable disease risk factors using the World Health Organization's recommendations. Very reputable organization. They analyzed adults and children. So sometimes it can be difficult with children. A 2-year-old, 3-year-old, 4-year-old probably isn't going to remember or write down what food they're eating very well. So that's where it kind of comes, the parents come into play a little bit more. So it can be a little bit difficult with that sometimes. So conclusion and significance of both of these articles is that they're very similar. There were significant differences in the nutrient content between the minimally processed and the ultra-processed foods. So decreasing the amount of ultra-processed foods was shown in these studies, these cross-sectional studies, to improve the diet quality. So the identified nutrients do agree with recommendations for a healthy diet. So the things that they were looking at, the nutrients that they noticed a change in, saturated fat, added sugar, fiber, protein, typically those are 4 really big recommendations that are proposed for just an overall healthy diet. So these are things we should be paying attention to anyway. The higher ultra-processed food intake did increase the prevalence of inadequate nutrient intake. So it did increase the risk of those non-communicable diseases, or at least those risk factors, for developing those. I do want to point out, though, since they are cross-sectional studies, correlation does not equal causation. So just because they're correlated doesn't mean we can show that these ultra-processed foods, these nutrients, are what is causing the other things. So it's a little bit more research. Since they're not directly having an intervention, that is one downfall for those. So kind of comparing the first 2 studies side by side for that evidence analysis library grading system. This one was also ranked neutral. So they compared the ultra-processed food and the non-communicable diseases. It was random selection, but not 100% random. The data is generalizable because they did choose about 50-50 of the population, so they're trying to include the adults and the children as well. They did use the World Health Organization and other reputable forms of data collection, data analysis, the measurements that they used, and the data collectors were blind, so same thing, they collected the data, but weren't sure how it was going to be used, so they weren't looking for specific things when they were analyzing. So the last study, specifically I wanted to dive into cardiovascular disease. So this was a cohort study where they looked at ultra-processed food intake and the risk of cardiovascular disease. So we're going to get a little bit more detail for this one. So their objective was to observe the association between consumption, ultra-processed foods, and the risk of developing cardiovascular disease. So that's going to include coronary artery disease, atherosclerosis, and stroke as well. So we'll combine all of those. So here's how the design was set up. This was an absolutely massive study. They had so many participants because it's an ongoing study in France. The population, it's a cohort study. So France, 2009 to 2018 is the data that they used, and this is a yearly study that they performed. 105,000 participants. They gave a little bit more detail about the population. They did all have to be adults, and the average age was almost 43 years old. So we got a little bit more details about that. To evaluate cardiovascular disease risk, they had a yearly questionnaire along with three-month checkups, and then they also used their social security number to monitor their electronic medical records. So if someone marked that they did, or the physician, the doctor did say that they developed cardiovascular disease in some way, they double checked with the electronic medical records. Same thing with someone said they didn't. So for the diet analysis, they perform a 24-hour online dietary record every 6 months. So the foods are categorized also using that NOVA classification there. So the breakdown, what specifically were they looking at? This one was a little bit different because they used weights of food as opposed to just calories and energy intake. So their thought process was that the weight accounted for energy-free foods and processes. So there are some additives you can put in the food that don't necessarily have calories, but are still considered processed foods. So they wanted to make sure they could include those. They used a system called Nutri-Score to calculate the nutritional value, and they adjusted for a lot of different factors. Saturated fats, sodium, sugar, red meats, beverages, and then salty snacks as well. So they were trying to eliminate any risk of there being a false positive or anything like that. So this is a breakdown. Had a nice little graph instead of my little makeshift ones and the other ones. Awesome table showing what the contribution of the ultra-processed foods came from. So they had the sugary products, fruits and vegetables, starchy foods and breakfast cereals, and again, these are in the ultra-processed food category. So what did they find? They found consumption of ultra-processed foods, or a higher consumption, did contribute to risk or prevalence, incidence of cardiovascular disease. Now, if you look at those numbers, those percentages are tiny, 0.02% and 0.008%, but when you compare them relative to each other, it's a significant difference there. Their sample size for each of these groups was huge, 25,000, almost 26,000. So even those little numbers do make a difference. So they found, essentially, expanding on that, nutritional quality. They found difference with sodium, energy, fat, sugar, higher glycemic response. All these are known factors for risk factors for developing cardiovascular disease. The ultra-processed foods contain high levels of glycation end products, which you found in sugar-sweetened beverages, confectionery, snacks, cakes, and these have also been shown in other research to accelerate risk of heart disease. They also found that the group with the highest ultra-processed consumption did eat fewer fruits and vegetables, so it makes sense. So the significance of this study is that there may be confounding factors, and they did address this in the article. Smoking, physical activity, while they analyzed for them, they run a lot, it's a really interesting article, they ran so many analyses in this, but they did address that other confounding factors could be contributing to the risk of cardiovascular disease as well, so they couldn't control for everything. It's hard to distinguish which had a bigger impact, whether it was the fact that they had higher ultra-processed foods or low nutrient-dense foods. So ultra-processed, and cardiovascular disease. The relationship remained even after adjusting for all those dietary components that I mentioned before. So, that being said, they established that they may have contributions from bioactive compounds that are kind of developed and included during the processing process. So, for this article, I thought they did a fairly good job. The surveys were completed using the internet. This could miss a population that does not have access to the internet. They linked the social security number to the medical records, which I think was huge. They can confirm and double check with individuals. Up-to-date assessments, they did the cardiovascular risk assessments every year, and then every 6 months, they did the dietary analysis as well. The highest quarter of ultra-processed food intake, they also tended to be younger smokers, have less education, family history, that's those confounding factors I was talking about. So it's actually, you can't kind of pin 2 and 2 together. While they have 10 years of data, it's a long time, but cardiovascular disease doesn't necessarily happen overnight. So it takes a little bit longer to that, and it's an ongoing study too. So also the weight versus energy I thought was very interesting. Different take on just the energy contribution there. So I gave this one a positive. Even though the selection bias could be focusing on people who have access to internet, I did a little research, and 84% of France's population does have internet access, so I think that's a fairly large population of France. They use electronic medical records, which is great. They use reputable sources for the measurements and data collection, and they also gave a lot of detail about monitoring the health history too, so I gave this one a positive rating system. So what can we do? What does this mean for us? Loosely using the term processed foods doesn't always carry that much weight. You really want to identify what the specific nutrient factors are in those processed foods, because then you can extrapolate that out and address that across the entire diet. Things like added sugar, saturated fat, fiber, sodium, potassium, those are the things that stood out the most as to the big differences between the minimally processed and the ultra-processed foods. So our role as educators, be an informed professional, be proactive, look up the research as it's coming out, learn about what's going on, understand the why, because if you can get people to value what you're talking about and understand that why, then it's more meaningful to them. So instead of just throwing out terms, be a little bit more specific, because not only are you helping educate them, but it kind of helps them have a little bit more detail into what they're looking for. So barriers, obviously cost and food availability, longevity are really big. Oftentimes ultra-processed foods do have a longer shelf life, they're cheaper, they're a little bit more available, so I have to take that in consideration when dealing with certain populations. There is a missed opportunity to get nutrients out of fear of eating processed foods. So I like to use the good, better, best methodology. It may not be the best option, but you're picking an option that is better than it could be, or you're picking a good option. So it may not be the best, but from what's available, you kind of have to cater that to each individual. And then I like to relate it to genetically modified foods. And this was really coming out. It's a really, really big thing. People were always scared of it. Scared doesn't always mean it's bad. So just kind of, as more research comes out, we'll be able to analyze and learn a little bit more things there. So I just wanted to end with this quote I found in one of the articles. I thought it was really valuable. So nutrition and food science professionals, the food industry, and other stakeholders can help to improve the diets of Americans by providing a nutritious food supply that's safe, enjoyable, affordable, sustainable, by communicating effectively and accurately with each other and working together to improve knowledge of consumers. So teamwork makes the dream work, right? That's how it goes. Working with all different people in different professions and just making sure you can kind of understand each other and see where your person is coming from. So, thank you. Questions, hit me with it. I do have a list of resources. Very small, but it's there. So if anybody would like, I can send those articles to you or